I just want to briefly introduce Durba Ghosh, who is heroically getting up at 4:30 in the morning in Cornell, in Ithaca. It's amazing that she's doing that from the United States. That's how much passion there is for heritage globally, and I think it's amazing. The reason she isn't here in person is because of the government shutdown in the United States. However, she is up at 4:30, bushy-tailed and ready to speak to us. Now, there is a little blurb about all the wonderful achievements Durba has achieved in her life and her books that you've no doubt read, but I would just flag to you her current and future work, which is about statues and colonial statues and how weirdly these statues move around the world. And I think that's absolutely fascinating work that I can't wait to hear more about, which Durba will be no doubt referring to. So that's all I had to say, and I'm very appreciative that you've all made it here today. And here I introduce you to Durba Ghosh from Cornell.
Good morning. I hope you can all hear me. I can't see you, so if you did want to put things in the chat or react, you're really welcome to. Thank you for that introduction, Joy, and thank you to Charles for setting this all up, and also to Lynn and Bryony. It's been amazing working with you, and I really, really, really was looking forward to seeing all of you today, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you. So I'll just start by saying it's a pleasure to think with you about the Historic Houses Global Crossroads Project. Joy and I had a really lovely chat, I guess, earlier this year in February, when Joy invited me to give this keynote and explain to me some of the wide-ranging interests that are in the room. So I'll just start by saying, as Joy mentioned, my interests were actually quite limited, in the sense that I started this project looking at statues in post-colonial India, and in particular the replacement of colonial statues with Indian nationalist figures. And then for a variety of reasons, I realized that the pedestals for all of these statues were the colonial pedestals. And in fact, statues in India had not been destroyed, but had been moved around. I won't say so much about it today, but some of the statues are removed to country homes in the UK after 1947. And so if you want to ask me about that in the Q&A, please do. So as you already know, each of the historic homes you study has a relationship with British colonies, whether it's from colonial wealth that funded these homes or objects that are moved from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Middle East to furnish interior spaces. Since I'm particularly interested in India, and I've been focusing on monumentalizing the empire, I'll focus on a set of statues that are replicated between Britain and other places, and they are busts. So I'll start with January 2023, and this was part of a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities here in the United States, which is now completely been eviscerated and has reframed its focus toward the United States. But back in 2023, as part of a funded project called Taj of the Raj that was led by Romita Ray at Syracuse and Tim Berenger at Yale. And under those auspices, a group of us visited the Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta, as well as a number of other sites in the city. This is the south view of the Victoria Memorial Hall. And in this image, you can see there's this equestrian statue of Edward VII. Probably you know that the Edward VII on an equestrian statue is replicated in many cities across the world. I won't say very much about that. But when we were there at the Victoria Memorial, and you can't see it in this image, but you can see it in this, we noticed that there was a row of marble busts of Roman emperors that lined the walkway. And you can see they're in this kind of green patch in front of the Curzon statue. Their names are captioned at the base so that it's a kind of educational display because it tells you the sequence of Roman emperors, and they are in chronological order: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and so on. The display is consistent with George Curzon's vision for the Victoria Memorial Hall, which was that the building was meant to show history through objects. And for those of you who don't know who George Curzon is, he was Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905 and is one of the primary patrons of the Victoria Memorial Hall. Designed and built between 1901 and 1921, Curzon imagined the hall as distinct from a country home, and it was something he repeatedly returned to. He frequently specified the Memorial Hall was also intended to be different from a museum. Instead, it was meant to be a public archive, an archive meant for people who would walk through the hall and experience the history of British India. He imagined displays that were about objects like knives, swords, turbans, clothing, as well as documents and other materials that showed how the British had made their impact in India. He was very clear that it wasn't meant to be like the Indian Museum, it wasn't meant to be an archaeological museum. And so what's interesting about the Victoria Memorial Hall is that he imagined it as a kind of a way of telling the history of India without having to read books, which is what he said. So on this trip, when we went to Calcutta, we also visited this building, Government House. It's the building now known as Raj Bhavan in Calcutta. Built at the turn of the 19th century, so roughly from about 1799 to 1803, it was the home of the British Governor General. It's now the official home of the Governor of Bengal and is largely a ceremonial space. The governor is appointed by the central government, and it's a ceremonial position in the sense that he doesn't have any governance responsibilities. The chief minister who's elected actually governs, and he lives in his own house, so not in this space. When we visited Government House, we were told that the busts that were in front of the Victoria Memorial Hall were originally stored in the basement of this house, the Government House. The Government House, as many of you know, if you've read Kate Smith and Margot Finn's magisterial edited collection, The East India Company at Home, you know that Government House, which is shown here, is a sometime replica or is drawn from the same architectural plans as Kettleston House in Derby. If you're looking at these two aerial views, you can see Kettleston House is actually smaller than Government House. They ran out of money and they only built 2 wings instead of 4. So one of the things I've become very interested in is this replication between the country home in the UK, which is often in the country, in a rural area that is meant to be some kind of respite from city life, and then the Government House, which is often in a colonial city and at the center of other government buildings, like the courts, for instance, or the town hall, and so on. So the replication of a private family country home in Britain to a public home for government officials was not unusual. And I'll just show you a slide of a home some of you may know. This is a slide of Osborne House. It's an Italianate-style country home that was built for Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. Like Kettleston, and I won't show you the interior, it has a hallway built for showing statuary, and it had a grand entrance to welcome political luminaries. This is Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and this is Government House in Melbourne, Australia, which was built just a decade later, as the British expanded its territories in the growing provinces of Australia. This was to mark the establishment of a new province in Australia, which is Victoria. And so just like Kettleston and Government House in Calcutta have very similar architectural features, so do Osborne House and Government House in Melbourne. In focusing on these monumental buildings as galleries for historic busts, I want to think about historic houses become sites of imperial business and governance. In these historic homes, their inhabitants commissioned, collected, and displayed a range of artifacts, and there are really too many to be listed here. So one of the things that's interesting is here, Government House, which was for the Governor General, the Governor General was able to express a level of cultivation that was designed to show a taste in art, as well as a knowledge of history. In this way, I want to argue that the historic home went through a process of being made historical. So if we think of the historic home as something we do to preserve the past, I also want to think about how the historic home became a display of historical figures who were central to expanding and governing the empire. The bust, both in marble and bronze, became a vehicle for historical affirmation and remembrance. So although the Romans are known for making busts as a form of death mask, by the 18th century they served to commemorate and decorate. And here, this is another Robert Adam design building. It's Newby Hall in Yorkshire. You can see I visit a lot of historic homes. I'll just say that this is in the Hall of Statues that's in a lot of these country homes. It welcomes visitors, but it also showcases some of the original art. And what's interesting about this display is that one of these busts is actually from the Roman period and was actually excavated in the 18th century. It's the bust on the left. It was, you can see, it's made of marble in this case. And then the bust on the right is made also of marble, but is an 18th century copy in the style of a Roman emperor. These busts are sometimes also made of bronze, and they become decorative features in these 18th century homes. And here you can see that for Robert Adam, with his Italianate style, he really liked these niches, these features, these architectural features where there's a kind of niche that showcases the statue. You can see the designs on the ceiling, and you can see how the British Empire in the 18th century, incipient in some places of the world, became a way to analogize from the Roman Empire. I'm not going to say too much more about these two busts, except to say that I was quite struck that there was an original from the Roman period and then what I would call a fake. And so when I asked the curator about this, she said, oh yeah, this was incredibly common in country homes. People wouldn't have really noticed the difference at the time, and I thought that was quite striking. So just return to Government House in Calcutta. And as you know, if you've read Chati Chattopadhyay, who's an architectural historian, she's noticed that the resemblance between Kettleston and Government House is only partial. The Calcutta Government House has 4 wings that lead from a rotunda. You can see here in this image. One of the things that she would also draw your attention to is that the rooms are not walled off from each other, in part because the air needed to travel through the building. It's a very different environmental context than Kettleston. And so rather than need to heat the room, they really needed the air to circulate. And so she would draw your attention to how open the building is in terms of having a circulation of air, but also a circulation of people, because unlike Kettleston, it's really meant to be a public building. In the post-colonial period, the home has been the home of the governor of Bengal. And until 2020, in the basement, as you can see from this photograph, Government House had a display of busts of Roman emperors. Located there since the late 19th century, the Roman heads, which are copies of sculptures found elsewhere, drew inspiration from an ancient empire whose imperial legacy bring the British Empire from the 18th century onward. When we visited in January 2023, we were told that these busts made of marble had been threatened with removal and possible destruction. The current government had made plans to quote-unquote decolonize the national collections. The Modi government demanded the removal of all European objects, which included paintings, sculptures, and the large-scale statues that were displayed around the Victoria Memorial Hall. And so all of these statues had actually been stacked in a corner and were being prepared for destruction. In order to prevent the loss of these marble busts, the past director of the Victoria Memorial Hall, Jayantha Sengupta, offered to have them reinstalled in the gardens of the Victoria Memorial Hall. And so you can see today, this is what they look like. Here you can see that they line the walkway on the southern side of the building. They're very vulnerable to the elements. Ordinarily, marble is not displayed outside, and busts are usually shown indoors. But what's interesting here is there are 12 emperors, and there's 6 on each side, and they're kind of chronologically displayed. And so I have a picture of all of them. I won't say more about it. What's quite striking is that, they have the little caption underneath it, but it's not quite clear what the purpose of having this display was, except that this was a way to preserve them. As you can see, the busts here seem a little bit afloat, but they are meant to be at eye level. So even though I had closely studied the catalogs of both Government House and Victoria Memorial Hall, I'd never seen the busts listed as objects on display. I have no idea when they arrived in India or who made them, and mostly it was puzzling to me how busts of Roman emperors related to the history of the British in India. I later learned from several people who work in Government House that they'd been there since the late 19th century. So this past summer, when I visited Kettleston Hall, it was really for the first time. And again, it was the Taj of the Raj group, and we were there for a conference. We were prepared to compare the two buildings, which are tied through the figure of George Curzon, who was Viceroy of India. George Curzon, this was his family home. Probably many of you know that. But when he returned from India, he modernized the building. So he added electricity, he added better plumbing. He made some other renovations, which I can say more about. What was quite striking was that if you're approaching, this is Kettleston, if you're approaching Kettleston from the driveway, this entrance, and you can see these terrace staircases look a lot like Osborne House. So it has that same kind of Italianate style. You can also see that there's these doorways on the ground floor, and so through the ground floor you can enter the basement. What I didn't expect to find was a collection of Roman busts in the basement that was similar to the group that I had seen in Calcutta. And I'll show you those right here. So this is just one of them. And you can see that it's installed in a kind of niche. You can also see the paint is peeling. There's not a caption. There's 12 of them. At Kettleston, the busts are situated in recessed spaces. They're not very prominent, and they're unlabeled. And what's quite striking is when I asked about these busts, they said, oh, we have no idea where they came from. We had our drinks in this area where receptions are held before guests are ushered into a dining area that holds the cafe that's usually open to the public. So again, busts that are almost exactly the same as the ones at our Government House. Upstairs at Kettleston, you can see the scale of what these displays were meant to look like at full size. Here's a classical statue with a partly robed figure and mythological kind of animals. As you probably know, the marble of the statues was real, but the marble columns that were sometimes painted to look like marble. These are actually wooden columns. In this play between the fake and the real, a feature of modern art that we attached to the latter half of the 19th century, historic homes were generating their own images of a historical past. So once I started seeing busts, I couldn't stop seeing them. And here is a hallway of busts at Powys Castle in Wales, which is home of the Clive family in India. This bust that's featured here on the left is a Roman emperor. The bust that's on the table is actually of a family member. The busts of more modern figures appear in a kind of similar shape, but they almost always have some kind of modern clothing to mark the age. Here's some more busts. Again, you'll see the range of possibilities. This, you can see I go to a lot of museums. This is from the Musée Granet in Aix-en-Provence, where there was a big Cézanne exhibit this summer. It's tucked in a hallway, and these are the luminaries of the city. What's interesting here, again, is you can see a series of styles, right? A Roman bust or Roman style bust, the second from the left, and the others in various states of dress, right, to show some of the key figures. of the city. And then if any of you went to the Edwardians, you saw this very modern bust. And this is of Queen Alexandra. The sculptor was Mary Thornycroft. Alexandra, of course, the consort of King Edward VII. And here you can see that it's really obvious that she is a royal figure. There's a kind of medal on her chest, and it's a very symmetrical bust. One of the things that's very interesting about this bust is, of course, it comes after the invention of photography. So we would have already known what Queen Alexandra looked like. This bust is intended to animate her in 3D. In this range of examples, busts were treated as both intimate and civic objects. You could display them at home as a sign of superior taste, even if the bust was a replica of a valuable archaeological find or a cheap copy of a more valuable original. As Deborah Cohn notes in her book Household Gods, middle-class Victorian families cultivated a habit of collecting ugly objects. Some busts were commissioned. Wealthy patrons enlisted famous sculptors to make marble likenesses of their loved ones. There were also gifts between intimates, a material form of commemoration and attachment. As objects of art, they were opportunities for famous artists to show their skills in replicating the human head. As objects of remembrance, which they often were, they were meant to remind the giver and the receiver of a person's impact and historical value. Even though the busts are portable and certainly more movable than the statues that were commissioned, it was expected that the home was the appropriate space for display. And yet, for the historically and archaeologically minded, country homes were far more than residential buildings or symbols of family wealth. Before the spread of museums or public buildings, they were important civic spaces where elite and landed people could share art, show off their grand architecture and imperial ambitions. The bust provided a historical record of who was important, when, and to whom. Once intended for country homes, busts are now ubiquitous in museums, libraries, and town halls. When I was in Worcester this summer for a conference, I found myself in the Worcester Museum, and this is actually not a very famous person. It's Charles Hastings, who's a local doctor. But the sculptor was Thomas Brock, who's the well-known 19th century artist who was from Worcester. And one of his most famous monuments is in front of the Worcester Town Hall, a Jubilee statue of Queen Victoria that is copied for at least 6 other imperial city centers. You probably all know Brock's memorial in front of Buckingham Palace. It's perhaps the most magisterial of his sculptures. But here you can see Brock practicing a shaping of the Queen's face for a bust that is in the royal collections. And so you can see that the bust became an important way in which an artist could show his finely detailed skills. I wanted to share this with you so you could see the scale of some of these busts. And you can see here the artist, he must be posing, but anyway, he's sculpting Queen Elizabeth. So I want to turn now to a different Hastings. One of the things I want to focus on is, this is Warren Hastings, for those of you who don't know. I want to end by proposing that busts became a way to tell a history that one desired, rather than the one that had occurred. Warren Hastings had served as the first Governor General of India. He was famously impeached and acquitted in a parliamentary trial that lasted nearly a decade, roughly from 1786 to 1795. When he was acquitted of crimes against the state, he commissioned a number of portrait paintings of himself and busts to give as gifts to his supporters. His supporters also commissioned busts to display in their homes, a sign of their allegiance to a figure who they believed had been wrongly accused. They're not quite memorial. Hastings was very much alive when these busts were made, but notably they show him in Roman garb as a way to align him with an imperial aesthetic. One of the many busts of Warren Hastings that were commissioned in the late 18th century and early 19th century was this one commissioned by his friend and ally William Petty, the Marquess of Lansdowne and the Earl of Shelburne. It was displayed at Lansdowne House in Berkeley Square in London until 1930, when the house was sold. And just to give you a sense of the house, this is what the house looked like. It was also designed by Robert Adam and occupied by a series of prominent Britons, including 4 prime ministers. In the mid-1950s, the bust was purchased for £54, and it was donated to the British government. It was then shipped to the home of the British Deputy High Commissioner in Calcutta, where it remains on display today. Considered a work of art, the bust shows Hastings bare-chested with a semblance of a toga over his left shoulder. This version is an early model of another more famous sculpture that Banks made out of bronze, which came out 5 years later. This version became the more famous version, has the same facial proportions, but it's notably not bare-chested. Instead, there is a robe draped across the shoulders, and this version was displayed at East India House on Leadenhall Street, where busts documented those who were well known as founders of the empire in India. As recent studies of the East India House by John McAleer and my colleague Jessica Ratcliffe explain, East India House was not just the corporate office of the East India Company, but an important hub for showcasing and exhibiting imperial knowledge. The museums of the East India House were turned over to the South Kensington Museums, where they became the foundation of the V&A Museum that we know today. East India House has replicas. There are usually two or four, many more busts, where one went to East India House, one went to parliamentary officials with whom the East India Company was trying to curry favor, and one went to Calcutta, where they were put on display either at the Asiatic Society, the Town Hall, but then eventually were gathered in the Victoria Memorial Hall. Copies of Warren Hastings busts are displayed in multiple places, and I'll just show you this one. Some of you may recognize it. This one is displayed in the manuscripts room in the British Library. There's also a copy of the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. There's also one in the storeroom at the Victoria Memorial Hall. I've worked numerous times in the manuscripts room, and I managed never to notice who the bust represented. There are numerous versions of this in the British Library, outside the loos, on the microfilm cabinets, and there are rows of them lining some of the reading rooms. Once you start looking, their ubiquity seems like a requirement. Busts are necessary for making spaces historically relevant. This is Warren Hastings in Westminster Abbey, and this one really is a memorial. It was, as you can see, commissioned by his wife Marion after he died. So I call this talk Empire's Replicas, in part because I wanted you to see how the bust could lend itself to being copied. A form that emerged from a Greco-Roman tradition, the bust became an important object that affirmed the historical value of its subjects in the modern era. So I want to end and leave time for questions. I'm eager to hear what you think. I want to end with this contemporary exhibit from the Museum of Modern Art in New York earlier this year by the German artist Thomas Schutte. For those of you who may not know him, he plays with historical sculptures, and he's become an important critic of monumental art that valorizes national patriotisms. Born in 1954 in Dusseldorf, Schutte's father had worked for Hitler, and he was imprisoned for 5 years after the war. As Schutte grew up, he became to be critical of the conceptual art that was the hallmark of post-war Germany. He was also critical of monumentalizing national figures, as was going on in East Germany. Much of his art has embraced figurative sculpture and experimented with statues and busts. When I walked through the exhibit earlier this year, I noticed a row of busts mounted high along the wall. Unidentified, they are bodiless faces that look down on the visitors below. And as you can see here, they're in a range of shapes and sizes, and that was partially the idea. So one looks more like a Roman head, one looks more like a contemporary head. The larger picture here, you can tell that the idea of the bust, which was once important for pedagogical and historical reasons, are now no longer essential to decoration. And as you can see in this exhibit, we can completely ignore the busts as we don't know who they are. So with that, I'll stop the share, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Could I just say one thing? That Chandrika, that was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. And I think what will be resonating in this room is Mount Stewart and what got replicated there. Because to some extent, what is replicated in that seat of empire is an imaginary past also, but it's an Indigenous Irish imaginative past. It's Tír na nÓg, it's this fantasy of a pre-sectarian, ancient past that's cleansed of all politics. So I think you have very recently been to Mount Stewart, and I think a lot of people will be thinking that thought that there's different things getting imagined or replicated in Mount Stewart. So I'll shut up and let people stick their hands up and get the microphone.
Hi, Durba. Thanks so much for that brilliant paper. It's Kate Smith from Birmingham. You can't see us, so I thought I should tell you who it is.
I see you now.
Okay. So I have a couple of quick questions, and it's your decision as to which one you answer, I guess. One, I was really interested in what you were saying about the moment in 2013 of trying to kind of decolonize the Roman statues and their movement into the garden, as if the garden is therefore some kind of neutral space devolved from the house. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit about that, and it kind of ties in with some of the things you were saying about, you know, how these busts are so normalized into kind of Western aesthetic that they become unnoticed in most kind of spaces. And then the other point is about the particularity of the historical analogy that's being built through the busts, and thinking about the call to kind of ideas of the Roman Empire and how this is kind of used in spaces of governance, and what that might tell us about, you know, empire and kind of a disavowal of what's happening in imperial kind of spaces, a kind of disavowal of the idea of democracy, and also about the kind of whiteness of this historical analogy that's being kind of built through these busts, both through the historicism that's at stake, but also through the actual kind of materiality of the busts themselves. And thanks for such a great paper.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm glad it resonated. Yeah, the garden. I mean, the book has a whole bit about the Victoria Memorial Garden, and in the post-colonial period in India, people imagine that they can send the statues that are on the Maidan in Calcutta to the Victoria Memorial Garden. And then there's a certain moment at which the curator of it's not even the curator, I think it's the chair of the board of trustees at the Victoria Memorial Hall says, enough, we don't want this to become a dumping ground for these colonial statues, right? So that's super interesting, right? And that there is a sense that the garden is this extra historical space, right? Even though the garden itself has quite a lot of statuary, right? When I asked John, though, about putting these Caesars, so Curzon called them Caesars, and it's never been very clear where they came from. But I think there is a reason that there's a version in Calcutta and a version in Kettleston. I just don't know. I think we haven't found out what it is. But when I asked John about it, I mean, his view was this was the Modi government had wanted to what they called decolonize the collections, and they had insisted that all the statues, the colonial statues that are at the Victoria Memorial Hall indoors, be removed. And he and the Archaeological Survey created this white paper that said basically because of the way the soil around the Victoria Memorial Hall is, it's soft, the statues that are inside are actually bolted into the floor of the Victoria Memorial Hall. So to take them out would have changed the integrity of the building. Right. So strangely, in this project to decolonize, the government didn't think of the garden as needing decolonizing, but thought of the building as needing decolonizing. And it's a kind of interesting imaginary, right, that the museum is this space where the public walks through and is educated in various kinds of history. The government has completely transformed the displays in the Victoria Memorial Hall. But, I went as part of this group, and then I went a couple of times just on my own as a tourist. And it's not really clear it's having the effect that the government wants it to have, right? Which is what made me start thinking that people expect to see these forums in a museum, not that they necessarily know what these forums are. So maybe that touches a little bit on the unnoticed, right? I think it's sometimes a little easy to say, of course, the regular Indian, Victoria Memorial Hall has 15,000 visitors a day. And it's not really, it's a picnic space, it's a family space, it's a tourist space. So it has lots of uses that have nothing to do with the busts and the statues that we work hard to preserve, right? So that's kind of interesting. It would be too easy to say, well, Indians don't really care about the Roman emperor busts, right? Except then when I started noticing the busts, right? The next time you go to the British Library, when you go to the bathrooms, especially on the second and third floor, you should look to see who those busts are. And they are actually quite famous sculptors who have made those busts, which is also very interesting, right? Let me just get quickly to the last question, Kate, which I think is really important. I mean, I think the particularities of the Roman era are very important for reasons that I don't fully understand. But I will say that I am interested in this. The reason I started with Newby, that I gave you that example of Newby Hall, is that it does speak to a kind of pre-colonial past that I think Joy raised. But what's interesting is that at some point it becomes very tricky to show bare-chested people in Roman garb in the colonies, right? And so there's some very early statues and busts of Queen Victoria where she looks like a Roman goddess. And they're quite, they're bare-shouldered, right? Her feet are in sandals. If you didn't know it was the young Queen Victoria, you wouldn't know it was Queen Victoria. But then as she gets older, after Albert dies, the robes, she becomes more robed, right? And in some, she becomes more modern and she has more clothes, as do a lot of these statues and busts. But in others, they wear modern clothes, and that becomes a big debate about how they should be shown, right? And so there is this sense that there's this artistic form that's classical, and then there's this modern purpose, which is that we have to show that these are the rulers of these colonies. Right, so I think there's an anti-democratic element there, and I think that there is an element of showing the superiority of white folks, right? Just to be clear, it's not till 1930 that an Indian is monumentalized in a statue at Victoria Memorial Hall, so quite late.
Yeah, it's maybe more of a comment, I don't know. But the very whiteness of the marble statue seems to me to be quite kind of significant, particularly because the Roman ideal that has, or perhaps that has been imposed upon the Roman ideal is actually not correct, is it? Because the Romans often painted their statues, so right. They weren't pure white marble at all. They had colours attached to them, so they were not like that originally. But then in subsequent centuries, that sort of white, clean white marble surface has become a sort of ideal. So I don't know whether you can comment on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have read about that. I think some of, maybe I'll answer it through the archaeological, right? I think when they were found in archaeological digs, and Curzon is one of these figures who's very archaeologically aware, the whiteness is because it's old, right? That it's antique and that it's been rubbed away. So I think that might be part of what's being replicated, right? And so I do think that the Roman style bust, they were intended, or there's an imagination that it's going to last into the future, right? So it's not just that you're marking an empire from, several centuries before, but also that you imagine that this form is going to resonate several centuries into the future. And so I'm less sure that they are deliberately trying to make it white. I'm more sure that they are trying to replicate an aesthetic that they see in these archaeological sites, and that they imagine, and I don't know if they imagine that this country home is going to decay and what will be left are these busts, but they certainly imagine that these busts and statues are going to outlast any other changes that are going to happen, because these are the objects they're finding when they are in archaeological sites, if that makes sense. Maybe I'll say it another way, actually. There's a wonderful book by Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby, an art historian, and she talks about the building of the Statue of Liberty, and she talks about how the people that were involved in submitting proposals for the Statue of Liberty actually studied the pyramids in Egypt because they were trying to think of the scale of sculpture. And so there, I don't think color is so much the importance, but form, I guess is the way I would say it. I see that some folks would like to ask questions in the chat. I'm happy to take them. The other thing I was going to say is I know you want to stay on time. You can also email me if you had some questions. I'm very sorry not to be there in person, obviously, but I'm happy to answer any questions by email.
Thank you, Durba. That was amazing. And for me personally, it's took my understanding way beyond the simple thing of, I just always thought that all this classical reference in historic houses was the attraction of an imagined past where slavery and democracy could somehow be combined, that it was a nice hierarchy, but this has taken it way beyond that simplistic idea, and I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you so much, and have a happy breakfast.